Alright, congruent triangles. That's our next little topic that we're going to start out with. So let's start with just kind of like more of an introduction type thing. And your learning target is I can use properties of congruent triangles to prove that triangles are congruent. Okay, let's get going. So corresponding angles, that's what we're going to talk about first. Corresponding angles are angles that are the same measure and the same position. They're in the same position. I need to spell position right. In congruent shapes. Okay, so corresponding angles are angles that are of the same measure and of the same position in congruent shapes. Now, congruent sides are sides that are of the same length and in the same position in congruent shapes. Okay, so if we had two shapes, you're talking about just the same measure, the same position for corresponding angles, same length, and same position for corresponding sides. Now, congruent polygons are made up of these corresponding sides and angles. Now, polygons can be considered congruent if their corresponding sides and angles are the same. So let's kind of explain this, dive into it a little bit more by going through some examples. Triangle RST and triangle XYZ represent the triangles of the space station support structure. Okay, and it's I hope you can see it in the video. I know on your paper you can see it, but we've got triangle RST is the support frame for one of the triangles, and then XYZ is the other part of the support frame. These two triangles make up to support the structure. And it says that if triangle RST is congruent to triangle XYZ, we need to identify all the pairs of congruent corresponding parts. Okay, so all that's saying here then is we need to identify what angles are corresponding, what sides are corresponding. So let's start with angle R first. And the angle that is congruent to, it's not Z, this is actually being rotated all the way through, it's actually angle X. So angle R is congruent to angle X. Angle S is congruent to angle Y. And angle T is congruent to angle Z. Okay? And we can see that just based on, here we've got R and X, S and Y, T and Z. It kind of gives us those. Now for the sides, to find corresponding sides, we're going to start with line RS, and that's congruent with line XY. So we're looking at RS is congruent to XY over here. Line ST is congruent to YZ. So ST is congruent to YZ. And then finally, we know that TR is congruent to ZX, which really is just the same line here. It's the same line. It shares that point. Okay, that's all you're doing. If you're asked to identify all the pairs of congruent corresponding parts, that means you need to make sure that you identify the corresponding angles and the corresponding sides. But that's all that you're supposed to do for those examples. Now example 2 says that we are given a triangle ABC. ABC is right here. Is congruent to triangle DBC. That's the information we're giving. And we want to find these two triangles are congruent. So we need to try to find what the value of X is and then find the measure of the angle DBC. So let's first focus on evaluating what the value of X is. And we know that this angle right here, because these two triangles are congruent, we know that that angle has to be 90 degrees. Therefore, 2x minus 16 must equal 90 degrees. Okay, so when you're faced with a problem like this, you just need to evaluate what is that angle degree supposed to be, or what is it corresponding to. So we have 2x minus 16 should equal 90 degrees. And then all we have is algebra. We're just solving for the value of x after that. So we have to add 16 to both sides. And we're left with 2x is equal to, this is 106. And then divide by 2 on both sides, And we end up getting x is equal to 53. So the value of x is 53. Okay, that's not too difficult. The only thing I just made sure that I did is I knew what the measure of this angle was 90 degrees, and then put x, this whole thing, equal to 90. All right, now it wants us to find the measure of angle DBC. So we're trying to look for this angle measure right here. And if these are congruent, okay, if these are congruent triangles, then we know that this measure right here is going to be congruent to this measure over on this side. And if these two are congruent, then we know how to find all three of these angles, because the angle sum in triangles, this is what we learned last unit, is all three of these angles add up to be 180 degrees. This one's 49.3, this one's 90. We just need to figure out what this one is. So if angle A is 49.3, then angle D is also 49.3. So we can say that the measure of angle D plus the measure of angle B plus the measure of angle C will equal 180 degrees. That's just based on the sum of angles in triangles. Now the measure of angle D, we already said, is 49.3, so now I'm just plugging in the information into our equation. B is what we're trying to find out, so I'm going to go ahead and just write that as B instead of the measure of angle B. I'm just going to write it as B. Plus C, which is a 90-degree angle, equals 180. Again, this is just solving now for our variable, which is B, the measure of angle B. Let's first combine like terms. 49.3 plus 90 is 139.3. And we're still adding that to B, and it's still going to equal 180. So we have to subtract 139.3 from both sides. And we end up, if we solve this, getting that B is equal to 40.7 degrees. 180 minus 139.3 is 40.7 degrees. So the measure of angle B then, or the measure of angle DBC, it's the same exact thing. If we just identify that B, when I'm talking about B for this, that's the measure of angle DBC. We'll go ahead and throw in a DBC there though, is equal to 40.7 degrees. Okay, that's it for example 2. Let's do the last one. All right, example 3 is about a proof, and we have certain given information, and we have some information that we need to prove, and we're using this 2-column proof system where we've got statements on one side and reasons on the other. And so we're given a lot of information. We're given that the angle YWX, that's this angle right here, and YWZ are right angles. So we know that both of these are 90-degree angles. We know that YW, this line right here, bisects angle XYZ, so that cuts these two angles into half. W is the midpoint between XZ, and XY is congruent to YZ. So we're given a ton of information. The thing that we're asked to do is prove that the triangle XYW is congruent to ZYW, that triangle. Okay, and so we're going to go ahead and go through statements and reasons, and when you're given a blank slate like this, the best thing to do is start with what's been given first, the first given information, and what you can imply based on that information. Okay, so we're given, the first given information is that angle YWX and angle YWZ are right angles. Okay, and the reason we can say that is given information. So based on that, if they are right angles, we can conclude then that angle YWX is congruent to angle YWZ. If they're both right angles, then they have to be equal to each other. And that just is that right angles are congruent theorem. That's the reason. If you said they're both right angles for your reason, that would be just fine. So there's really, given that information, we cannot do too much more except to note on our diagram here that these are two right angles, that they are congruent. So let's go to our second given. The second given is that line YW bisects angle XYZ. So YW bisects angle XYZ. Okay, we know that again because that's given information. And we can conclude then, based on that information, we can conclude that angle XYW is going to be congruent to angle ZYW. Angle XYW has to be congruent to angle ZYW. And the reason why we can conclude that is that if this line bisects it, that means that this angle was cut in half. Okay? And so that's the definition of bisecting angles. We know that because of the definition of bisecting angles. Okay? Now, what else can we conclude about this? We just said that these two angles are the same. Okay? And if those two angles are the same and these two right angles are the same, then we can also say that angle X is congruent to angle Z. Right? Angle Z. The reason we can say that is because that's the third angle theorem. Okay, if we have two, we learned about this last unit, we have two angles that are congruent, that means that X and Z also have to be congruent. If you have a triangle and you have two angles that are the same, then that third angle has to be the same as well. All right, and then we can't really do too much more with just that information, but we do know now, if we draw this in, that we've got all of our angles are congruent. All of the angles are congruent. Remember, a congruent triangle has congruent angles and congruent sides. So let's kind of shift gears now. Let's talk about what we know about lengths. And we know that the next given that we were given is that W is the midpoint of XZ. Okay? If W is the midpoint of XZ, then, this is given. If that is true, then we know that XW has to be congruent to ZW. And the reason why we know that is because that is the definition of what a midpoint is. That's the definition of midpoint. Okay, so we can go in here and we can say that these two lines are congruent. And we can also do one other thing with lines, just because we know YW, that's a shared line. We can also say then that YW in this triangle is congruent to YW in the other triangle, and that's because they're the same line. Okay, so now we know that these lines are congruent. We know that this line is the same, so that's congruent. And the last thing that we need to tell is if XY is congruent to ZY, and we can see that that's our last piece of given information. That XY, line XY, is congruent to YZ. So we can say these two lines are congruent as well. And now once we've done all that, we can see then that all of these are congruent. Therefore, triangle XYW is congruent to triangle ZYW. And that is the definition of congruent triangles, based on all that information that we just went through and talked about. Hey guys, I apologize. I know this video is a lot longer than we normally are, but it's important information that you need to know. Hope you're having a great and wonderful day. Enjoy it, and we'll see you next time.